This episode was brought to you by CuriosityStream, plus Nebula. Hey everyone, it's Anais and welcome back to Draw Curiosity. I don't know if you've ever appeared on television or on some other type of recorded event, but if you have, chances are you were probably sent some sort of guideline on what to wear, and especially what not to wear. Some of those things might have seemed perfectly sensible, whereas others might have been quite confusing. The most memorable list I ever received was a time I appeared on a game show in South Africa, and we were sent a 22 bullet point list. Extremely thorough, and it actually might be one you might have seen if you've taken any sort of media training or looked this up, because apparently it's quite a popular list. But anyway, I found this list very striking. I spent time thinking about it. I didn't necessarily agree with all of the points on it, but I was very interested in the technical and cultural reasons behind them. So this video actually takes these bullet points, groups them into broad categories, and goes through them quite comprehensively so you can understand exactly why certain clothes are encouraged and discouraged from being worn when appearing on TV, so you can understand the intricacies and the technicalities of what breaks cameras when recording, and most of all, so you can make your own informed decisions on what to wear and why when appearing on camera. Let's start with some of the simpler ones first before we delve into the fun science and technical parts involving cameras, and later on we will end on the more nuanced points. One of the most common ones is a call to wear clothes without logos on them. No visible logos or companies or brands except for your own company logo. Unless, of course, it's your own logo. This is obviously for copyright reasons, because if there's no affiliation between the company and the TV production, then the company could make a claim that the person wearing the logo is misrepresenting them in some way and lead to legal problems, and so the producers would ideally need to seek permission to display the logo or just avoid displaying the logo altogether by blurring all of the footage in post-production, and that in itself can be quite distracting. Remove jewellery that moves, makes noise, or could hit your microphone. Wearing long jewellery is generally discouraged because the metal can make a noise when it collides with the microphone, and generally poor audio is less forgivable and a lot harder to rescue than, say, poor visuals, because it requires a lot more mental effort from the viewer to actually filter out that noise and understand what is being said. Don't wear dangly earrings, they distract. Dangly earrings are discouraged too. I don't have holes in my ears, so I can't really demonstrate this one, but they can be quite distracting, and from a much more practical perspective, anything dangling near your face runs the risk of getting caught in an earpiece if you need to wear one, or in your hair, which could be quite uncomfortable. I've certainly had lots of problems with that when I had much longer hair. Don't wear more than one ring per hand. Whilst not dangling jewellery, multiple rings on one hand are generally discouraged too. On the one hand, I would say this is honestly a style or a fashion choice, but it is true that if these rings are on adjacent fingers, then there's a much higher risk of the rings clacking against each other, which again could easily be picked up by a lapel microphone and be distracting for the viewer. I actually have a spinner ring, and occasionally, if it spins close to the microphone, you can hear it. TV viewers should focus on your face and what you say, not your clothes. In fact, basically avoiding things that are distracting is the general mantra of this list, by either not calling for the viewer's attention or by avoiding interference with the video or the audio. And it makes sense because attention spans are quite finicky, and it's true that we occasionally notice or we can't unsee things that distract us from the overarching message of the content we're watching. But I have to say, I've also found in my very personal experience on this channel that what different people notice, are bothered by, or fixate on is also highly individual, and occasionally distracting elements can have a purpose. For example, I've received countless comments whenever I've worn a fuzzy microphone outdoors. I know it attracts attention, but it's there to make sure the audio sounds good even if there's a gale blowing. Likewise, I received comments on my traps. Apparently they are quite noteworthy. Got them from my dad. And obviously when my hair was a lot longer, it also attracted a lot of attention. Surprisingly, the pink hair hasn't yet. But, you know, in those cases, there wasn't very much I could do about that. Don't Don't wear white, black or red. Picking extremes is always potentially risky. White and black are quite easy to explain. White glows and becomes the most noticeable thing on the TV screen. Avoid light-coloured pants. It's quite easy for white to end up overexposed and therefore draw a lot of attention to itself and look weird compared to other colours. Black is too harsh and can suck up all the light. Meanwhile, black can easily have the opposite problem and be easily underexposed, and therefore, if corrected for, be prone to showing noise on it. Or on the other hand, just look too dark and featureless when the artifacts are corrected in post-production. If you wear a dark shirt, dark suit and dark tie, you will look like you are auditioning to be a hitman on The Sopranos. Likewise, there's also the risk that if you're in front of a pure white or a pure black background on set, if you wear the wrong bold colour, then you risk blending into the background. Reds bleed on camera and are distracting. Next up, the reason for avoiding red, as well as quite honestly any other bright colour, especially bright green and bright blue, involves understanding how camera sensors work compared to our own eyesight. We perceive colour through our cones. We have 3 types which are sensitive to 3 wavelengths of light, red, blue and green, and the integration from the information picked up by each one is what allows our brain to interpret those stimuli as colours. Camera sensors aim to emulate the human eyes in their arrays by detecting similar colours. The most common type of camera sensor used are known as colour filter arrays, or CFAs. They're an array of pixels, each one with a Bayer filter placed over the top, which enables them to be sensitive to certain wavelengths of light, red, green and blue. Now, in order to approximate the fact that our eyes are generally best at recognising and discerning green, 50% of the pixels are devoted to detecting green, which reduces the noise in the green channel. This actually means that the remaining 50% is split into 25% for detecting blue and 25% for detecting red. And because blue has a shorter wavelength, it is also slightly harder to detect, and therefore the channel is often amplified automatically in post-production, which can potentially make blues a little bit more saturated and also slightly more noisy, although this is going to be a topic for a future video. On the other hand, because red has a longer wavelength, it is generally more effectively detected by the sensor. So on top of that, when taking photos outdoors or under studio lights, which often mimic daylight settings, the natural light is quite bluish due to the wavelength of sunlight. So in order to achieve a white balance that looks more natural to us, this often entails boosting the red channel to counteract the extra blue, which means that the red channel is a lot more likely to be overexposed, leading to red and magenta objects to clip in the red channel and therefore bleed in the image. So in fact, bright colours quite often spill or bleed over into other colours, which can be somewhat distracting and also tougher to correct in post-production. And it's also hence why oversaturated colours are avoided altogether to avoid this risk in the first place. Likewise, depending on the studio, green and blue are also often risky colours because they can be used with green screens or with chroma keying. And, you know, that's just asking to be memed. Don't wear stripes, herringbones, small intricate designs or flashy jewellery. They are hard for a camera to pick up on. Don't wear tight patterns. Be wrinkle-free. Don't wear checks. Don't wear stripes. They dance around the screen and are distracting. Another common request is to avoid wearing tight patterns such as checks, thin stripes, herringbone, polka dots, other busy patterns, and the reason for this is that they might not be picked up properly by the camera or shown properly on a TV or computer screen, and this artifact or interference is known as moiré. A moiré pattern is a large-scale interference pattern that pops up when 2 quasi-similar patterns are overlaid upon each other. By quasi-similar, I mean rather than being perfectly overlaid, one of them has been displaced, rotated, resized, or distorted in some plane with respect to the other one. You've probably seen moiré patterns before in items such as rich plastic display cases or overlaid pieces of netting or fabric. However, you might be wondering how come moiré happens when you take a photo of a computer screen or a type pattern, given in theory just a single pattern is being captured. And there are actually 2 ways moiré can happen in film. The first is to do with the pattern of the pixels on the sensor. If the resolution of the camera's sensor is insufficient to resolve the detail of the pattern displayed, it will act as the interfering pattern and therefore it will lead to a moiré effect, which is why when you look at a computer screen with your own high-resolution eyeballs, it doesn't moiré, but when you video or photograph it, it can moiré if the resolution is insufficient to resolve it properly. In order to counteract the Moiré effect, many cameras used to have a blurring filter overlaid on top of the sensor, thus adding an anti-aliasing effect. Anti-aliasing is basically that soft blurry effect that is added to rasterized images so they don't look as pixelated and sharp and choppy. It comes from anti-alias because it's getting rid of the artifact caused by the aliases. Of course, this can potentially mean a trade-off in sharpness and avoiding visual artifacts, as well as potentially decaying an image that may already have a lower resolution than one might desire, because that's why the Moiré happened in the first place. Now that modern cameras have higher resolution sensors, the likelihood of Moiré being detected is actually a lot lower, because only the very fine detail that lies in the Goldilocks zone, where the size of the patterning happens to coincide with the limits of the sensor's resolution, is likely to cause it. Therefore, not all modern cameras actually have anti-aliasing filters built over the sensor, and whilst the risk of Moiré on the whole is a lot lower than with lower resolution sensors, it's still a pain to make Moiré less obvious when it does occur, so tight patterns are discouraged. The other way Moiré can happen in film is through what is known as interline twitter, which is an artifact caused by interlace video scanning. Interlace video scanning is actually a very clever video recording technique that gives the perception or the illusion of a double frame rate, which makes video footage appear a lot smoother and is a little bit easier on the eyes, but without requiring twice the bandwidth nor necessarily a faster sensor. In essence, the image is divided into 50 fields which are scanned every second, with those lying on odd-numbered lines being scanned in the first half, followed by those lying on even-numbered lines in the second half. This therefore gives the illusion of a 50 frames per second refresh rate. However, in doing this, there's obviously the potential problem of combing. There are good algorithms nowadays which will actually reduce the appearance of combing. They average out the two frames and shift them together, translating them or displacing them. But when it comes to scanning fine patterns such as, a nice herringbone jacket or some stripes, especially when the person sporting them is in motion, that difference in time between scanning your odd lines and the even lines might have a similar effect to those superimposing quasi-similar patterns that we saw earlier, because the movement from the person is the one that's causing that displacement effect, and it will just be enough to cause Moiré on screen. Now, the last three, they include two don'ts and also the recommended what you should wear on TV. In my personal opinion, I think they're a little bit more subjective. I think they're a little bit more open to interpretation. So I'm going to state them. I'll obviously explain why that recommendation is made, but also explain my perspective as to why I personally think they can be challenged or certain rules can be broken, as long as you know you're breaking those rules. Avoid hair products that add shine. One of these points was to avoid hair products that add shine. That being said, admittedly, I generally think people are looking for ways to make their hair shinier or look more lustrous rather than dull, especially if they're going to appear on TV. So it does make me wonder, maybe certain hair products can give the impression of greasy hair or wet hair, which, might be undesirable. The only other instance where I can think shine is generally avoided is in the case of oilier skin, where you might want to use a more mattifying powder to soak it up and then avoid looking extra shiny under the studio lights. However, if it is a TV production, then generally there'll be a crew and a makeup artist, and they'll be there ready to touch you up with a brush and some powder so you stop shining. No showing skin. Finally, the one which I found appeared the most by far on the list boiled down to not distracting the audience with your attire and not showing skin. This is perhaps the part where I personally think it's a more nuanced matter or context dependent. Basically, people shouldn't judge you by your appearance, but they will. And unfortunately, it's true, and it sucks. However, as William Hazlitt says, prejudice is the child of ignorance, and the main antidote to ignorance is exposure and education. Men should have about an inch of their shirt cuff showing. I think this is because longer supposedly looks a little bit scruffier, but shorter can, oh la la, show off a little bit too much of his skin. Wear over-the-calf socks so your skin doesn't show if you cross your legs. Women shouldn't wear short skirts if you want people to focus on your message. On the one hand, short dresses and skirts without culottes can be a danger when sitting down because there is a risk of flashing underwear if not careful. However, I would still rephrase all of these statements as people should wear what they feel most comfortable and confident in. I understand why this advice is given, because it's definitely not nice to unwittingly be on the end of nasty comments that ascribe judgment, often incorrect to the way one dresses or as the result of a wardrobe malfunction. On the other hand, I also think it's worth breaking the notion that if one shows skin or dresses in a very particular way that is different to the norm, that they can't have anything interesting to say or add. In my experience, appearances and personal style are generally unrelated to the quality of the contributions someone can make, so I also think it's a good idea to attempt to challenge this bias on occasion by avoiding prejudice based on presentation and actively learning to focus on contributions, as opposed to simply reinforcing our biases categorically by certain attire. However, human psychology and what different people notice and pay attention to, as we said earlier, is finicky, because it's highly individual and culture and context dependent. And I'm fully aware and will own up to the fact that, to some degree, all of this has been a personal frustration of mine. I grew up in the south of Spain, where our summers reached the high 40s, so of course everyone wears tank tops and cleavage and short shorts, because it's hot and we don't want to roast in our clothes. And thus, for me, those clothes are my most comfortable clothes, with no further connotations ascribed to them than that. Likewise, I used to go to swimming lessons, cheerleading, and more recently pole dancing, amongst others. All of those involved seeing and interacting with, honestly, very highly accomplished and very interesting people who just happened to be in, less clothing than the norm or wearing slightly more unusual attire, but that didn't erase the other facets of those people I was interacting with. However, I'm also aware that had I not done these activities, then I too might be more likely to judge people who dress and present differently to the wider norm. So for this reason, I'm on the fence about this advice, because I would generally like to invite people to challenge their mental biases, especially if what I'm suggesting here feels uncomfortable, because I do truly think that our appearance is separate to our contribution. If you do or wear anything distracting on TV, people will remember that and nothing you say. If you have the confidence, I don't think it's wrong to dress differently or even stand out, if you choose to. As I said earlier, if the distraction has a purpose, I think the avoiding distracting rule is more than fine to break. In this case, dressing differently can provide an opportunity to expand the viewer's exposure to new styles, whilst also challenging stereotypes that may be associated to them. I personally think it's okay and encouraged to learn about and understand other subcultures and styles, even if you don't personally partake in them or are interested in partaking in them. On the other hand, receiving unwanted attention can also be exhausting. So honestly, if it makes someone more comfortable to blend in for a media appearance, I also don't blame them. You can make your choice and either is fine. Vests look stuffy on TV. Dress in a simple, boring manner, unless you are a fashion designer. As highlighted in the earlier points, it's true that clothes on TV and media can look very different to how they do in real life. So if you have less experience with how things tend to look on camera compared to how you see it in the mirror, it can be worth playing it safe. However, also on a separate note, I still think style diversity is important on a show, because you want people to be distinctive and memorable, and not just to appear as different versions of each other. So as ever, I'm still going to reiterate, it's a balance to be struck. Ultimately, I personally would love to see a lot more diversity in style on television. I'd love to see men not necessarily just wearing suits and ties, but perhaps also more comfortable clothes or even more fashionable clothes, as well as also women being able to sport whatever style they want without it attracting denigrating comments for being too risque, too modest, or too bold. And I would certainly love to see a lot more gender non-conforming attire on TV too, and for none of these to be immediately associated with negative stereotypes. Hi, one can dream. Anyway, so finally, we've learnt about everything we shouldn't be wearing on TV. So what are the safe options? Pastel shirts work well on TV. Again, this is where I think there's a little bit of wiggle room for nuance. Pastel colours are unsaturated, so you're much less likely to get that bleeding effect that I described earlier. However, there are some very notable exceptions where I would recommend against pastels. The first is I would be very careful with nude colours that match your skin tone or that might be similar to it in some way or be on the same luminance scale, because they can give the impression of showing skin even when you weren't. Actually, as a funny story, I posted this video 2 years ago. There was actually more than one person who watched that video and messaged me or commented on it, thinking that I was naked underneath those dungarees. I actually wasn't. I have a grey tank top on, but admittedly, because of the cut, and also because the colour, it just blended in very well with the dungarees and my skin tone, and it just created the wrong illusion. The other exception is if you're on a very bright set, that is, if you've got very bright colours behind you. Then pastels will actually make you look washed out, and unfortunately it's just better to wear bolder colours there to compete with the background. The safest colour on TV is blue. Now, I would say this is sound advice, and whilst I do personally love the colour blue, I do have my slight personal vendetta against it in film. I'll go into it in another video, I know I've been hinting at it. But basically it boils down to, if you remember how red and blue share 25% of the pixels on the CFA, but blue was the one with the poorest detection from the sensors? Yeah, basically it means that blue, in my opinion, has the tendency to just be a little bit noisier on camera, a bit grainier, doesn't look as nice, I think. So for me, that's the reason for which I tend to avoid blue where I can. However, pastels, as I said, they usually look good, and in all honesty, I'm yet to meet someone who doesn't suit blue. So if you don't know what to do, I guess it's blue. I do actually back this advice. Pastel blue is a good colour. Anyway, that's everything for today. Wait, no, it's not quite over yet, because today's episode is sponsored by CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is the first streaming platform devoted specifically to feeding people's quest to learn, explore and investigate more about our world, and they offer thousands of documentary and non-fiction titles to their users, and you can enjoy a hefty discount on me by going to curiositystream.com/drawcuriosity. I most recently watched More Than Honey, mostly because, as you know, I absolutely love bees, and frankly, in the times we're in, I just like watching things that make for very pleasant watching, and these bees sure had no Moiré problems despite their stripes. A CuriosityStream subscription also includes a free Nebula subscription, enabling you to view and support more of your favourite educational creators with none of those pesky YouTube adverts. And also, incidentally, Nebula is now Streamy nominated. Anyway, back to the outro. I really hope you found this video interesting and that you now have an enhanced understanding as to what you should wear and what you should never ever wear to appear on television, or at least to understand why people wear what they do and why you never see certain types of fashion on TV. As ever, thank you so much to my amazing patrons on Patreon for supporting my content. And as always, thank you so much for watching me, and I'll see you in the next one.